Good afternoon, everyone. I am Diana Sukram, Dean of the School of Education. Welcome. I would like to introduce the Suny Old Westbury President, Dr. Sams. President Sams has spent the last 30 years driven by the principles of access, excellence, success, and impact. After a year on the job, he has proven to be a transformational leader who truly cares about elevating students' educational experiences at Old Westbury. He values varied perspectives, is inclusive, data-driven, and action-oriented. He is committed to excellence. His commitment to excellence is evidenced by his support of programs like this one we're a part of today. I would now like to welcome Dr. Sams.
Thank you, Dr. Sukram. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. I mean, let's set an example for our Chancellor today. I'm going to stick to the script. I'm not going to go off the script. At least I half-heartedly promise. A little over a month ago, we sat in the same room exploring the life and times and impact of African-American women superintendents, or what we learned to be called SUPs, right? For those who were in attendance, you must agree with me that that moment was insightful and very rich. The quality of the discussion created a buzz for weeks to follow, so much so that we are here today. They say that the reward for good or even great work, Dr. Sukram, in the School of Education is more work, right? While we thank you for the good work that you did back in March, we do so asking you to continue to expand upon your role in helping us to understand the role that education plays in addressing life's most pressing issues. So we're asking for more work from you, and here we are. It is in this spirit that we find ourselves here today with our New York State Chancellor. While it is not my responsibility to introduce the Chancellor, it is my role to say welcome to you. Or should I say, welcome back to Suny Old Westbury, because remember, he was here back in March. I hope that you will find Suny Old Westbury, Mr. Chancellor, to be a valuable partner in your ongoing quest to educate and transform the lives of New York State citizens. Please know that we stand ready to do our part in this work. In addition to welcoming our Chancellor, I also want to welcome all of you here tonight, or this afternoon, to hear from our Chancellor. Whether you're a member of the Old Westbury community or just visiting us to hear from him, please know that we truly appreciate every single one of your presence today. I'd also like to extend a couple of shout-outs or a special welcome. And I'm going to ask you to please stand. First, my schoolmate, so she has to go first. My schoolmate, Ms. Doris Waiters, an associate in higher education opportunity and the program officer for the MBK Teacher Opportunity Corps 2 program. We went to school together. That means she's 35. Mr. Lionel Chitty, president of the Old Westbury Alumni Association and co-sponsor of our meet and greet green tea party this afternoon. Is Mr. Chitty here? Okay. Well, at least he sent his money for the party, right? All right. Okay, he did do that, everyone, all right? Ms. Anissa Moore, Deputy County, is she here? Well, in her abstention. Deputy County Executive, Health and Human Services, Office of the Nassau County Executive. Oh, there they are. That's the line over there. There they are. See, if you walk up now, they'll see who I just introduced. Ms. Tracy A. Edwards, Commissioner of the New York State Public Service Commission. Welcome back, Tracy. Dr. Angelique Johnson Dingle, recently appointed Deputy Commissioner, P-12 Instructional Support by the State Education Department Commissioner Rosa. She is also a member of our School of Education Advisory Board. Welcome. Ms. April Frances Taylor. Okay, not here yet. Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusivity, Eastern Suffolk BOCES. And to the various principals and other P-12 leaders from across the region, please feel welcome. Finally, I want to say thank you to Dr. Sukram and the School of Education for putting this event together. Thank you and welcome again to everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Sams. Our guest speaker for this evening's event is none other than Dr. Lester W. Young, Jr., Chancellor and at-large member, New York State Board of Regents. Lester W. Young, Jr. is serving his fourth term as Regent at Large, the University of the State of New York, in January 2021. Dr. Young was unanimously elected by his peers to be Chancellor. Dr. Young has made creating opportunities where every student can be successful the guiding principle of his more than 50 years of public service. A career educator, Dr. Young served as a teacher, guidance counselor, supervisor of special education, principal, associate commissioner with the State of New York Education Department, and superintendent of Community School District 13. He also led the first NYC Office of Youth Development and School Community Services. A recognized educational leader and innovator, he was responsible for establishing some of the more successful high schools and middle schools in New York City and reproducing the nationally recognized Algebra Project and Commerce School Development Program. Dr. Young's commitment to helping improve outcomes for boys and young men of color led to the establishment of NYS My Brother's Keeper initiative, and under the leadership of the NYS legislature, New York State remains the only state in the nation to have the My Brother's Keeper initiative enacted into NYS law. Continuing his commitment to public service, in 2014, Dr. Young was appointed to the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. He is a founding member and current chair of the Adelaide L. Stanford Institute and co-chairs the Community Advisory Council for Boys and Girls High School. He is a life member of the National Alliance of Black School Educators and Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity. He has also served on the advisory boards of Eagle Academy High School and the New York office of the Children's Defense Fund, the Brooklyn Children's Museum, and the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation. Dr. Young volunteers as a mentor to principals and aspiring leaders throughout New York City. He has been recognized by many local, national education, and civil education organizations for his professional contributions. Let's give a round of applause for our accomplished speaker, Chancellor Young.
Thank you for that, Dr. Sukram, for that more than generous introduction. Good evening. Good evening. President Sams, SUNY Old Westbury faculty, guests, it is an honor and a pleasure for me to be back with you this evening to talk about something that I think is perhaps one of the most important topics we face in public education nationally, but certainly in New York State. On behalf of my colleagues on the Board of Regents and our Commissioner of Education, Dr. Betty Rosa, I bring everyone greetings. I would also like to give a special thanks to Dr. Sukram for her leadership in bringing us together. One of the challenges with the topic we're going to talk about this evening is that often when we talk about this, it's as though we're in the Roman Colosseum. And you might understand what I mean by that, because there are some people who are rooting for the person with the blade and the spear, and then there are other people who are rooting for the lion. And what typically happens in that scenario is that everyone just digs in their heels and they just keep rooting until someone is down. And I would say that if we continue in that fashion, we'll never get to a resolution. The other way to think about it is, if we continue to discuss difficult topics as if we're in that Colosseum, no one really wins. And so part of what I want to get to this evening is, how do we have these difficult conversations? Because I believe, like I'm sure many of you in this audience believe, that we need everyone. So this is an extremely important convening, and I believe, like many educators, that the education of our children and youth is perhaps the most important thing we could do as a nation and as a state. And it is important for those of us who are really concerned with the development of our young people that we figure out ways in which we could lock arms together and do everything that is necessary to ensure that all New York State students go as far as their hopes, their dreams, and their hard work will take them. And I also believe that education is an essential route to that path. And as I thought about my remarks this evening, it occurred to me that I believe we are in what I would describe as an incredible moral moment. And what do I mean by that? The decisions that we make in this moment, the actions that we take in this moment, what we deem important in this moment, and who we deem important will impact generations to come. The other way that I think about this moral moment is that we have an opportunity to do something that has not happened yet. And that is to build education systems where every student has an opportunity to be successful. See, we have some of the best schools on the planet right here in New York. The challenge that we have is that not everyone has access to those schools. And so, and I'll go a step further. Some of that is by design. And so we have to dig deep, search deep, and try to figure out, number one, do we really, truly believe in the value and worth of each and every young person who attends our public schools? And if the answer to that is yes, then we have to ensure that we build systems that are designed to educate all young people, not just some, right? Not just the ones who are fortunate enough to have well-connected parents, or two parents, or working parents, or young people whose language is other than English, or young people who might not look the way we all look. And so there's an opportunity for us in this moment to do what has not occurred before. Now, it's interesting. I told someone recently. I don't usually say this. I'll say it today. That now that I find myself in prime time. Some of you know what that means. I think about things that I hadn't thought about before. I think about things like, what kind of ancestor will I be? Right? I think about when people say Lester W. Young Jr., will they say he was the Chancellor, or will they talk about the contribution that I made? So those are the things that I think about. The other point that I would say in the time that I have is that I think about things historically. So if you indulge me from time to time, I'm going to put things in a historical context. So the first, there's a very important historian. His name is Dr. James Anderson. If you haven't heard of him, I suggest you should Google who he is. But Dr. Anderson says that good history always tells a story, and in so doing provides a way of looking backward as a vehicle for moving forward. Looking backward as a vehicle for moving forward. And so for those of you who study African symbols, you know that the Sankofa bird, the feet are moving forward, but the head is looking backwards. Right? But there's a symbol of movement, right? And the idea is that in order to move forward, you have to be cognizant of where you've come from. And so one of the challenges we face in education right now is all across the country, there are those who would like to deny where we've come from. And I would say to you that that's a dangerous place to be. Because I just think about my own lifetime. As someone who went to school in Richmond, Virginia in 1961, see, I will tell you that we're light years away from where we were then. And so I would say to you that we've made tremendous progress. But I also recognize that we have much more to do. And so I really appreciate what Dr. Sam said, that when you work hard, that just entitles you with the right to even work harder, right? That's the award. And so Dr. Anderson also says that it's crucial for an understanding of American history to recognize that within American democracy, there have been classes of oppressed people that have been essential to the relationships between popular education and the politics of oppression. And so what is he saying? He's saying that throughout American history, there have been two types of education. There have been the systems that were designed to benefit some and advance some, and then there have been the systems that were designed to keep people where they were. And throughout, and if you study American history carefully enough, you will see that throughout our march toward democracy, right, that we've made progress. I mean, just think about where we were and where we are. There's another statement, a historical statement, and it goes something like this. And some historians credit what I'm going to say with the beginning of public education. It goes like this. It's very simple. It says that a nation that expects to be free and ignorant expects the impossible. And that kind of makes sense, right? There's a relationship between freedom and knowledge, freedom and learning. Now, you might say, why is he telling me that? It sounds like it's common sense. I'm telling it to you because the person who said it and the time that it was said, and maybe I should just say who it was Thomas Jefferson. And when Jefferson made the statement in Virginia, 2/3 of the children were enslaved Africans. So when he talked about this business of being free and ignorant, he wasn't really talking about everyone, right? And so from that moment until now, there has been this struggle to figure out how do we build a system that is true to the founding of the beliefs and values of America. So that's really what we're here to talk about today. So when someone casually says, oh, we're going to talk about DEI, see, I will tell you that I try not to even use that expression because diversity, equity, and inclusion are 3 different things, right? They're different, and they mean different things. And there's something that gets lost in the translation when we just talk about DEI. Now, what do I mean by that? I will give you these anecdotes as I talk because I just have to do this. I was recently in a school district, and the superintendent said, you know, Dr. Young, I want you to come with me because I want to show you some DEI. Right? I mean, and this was the leader of the district. He said, I want to show you some DEI. And I chuckled because I was trying to maintain myself. Right? I was really trying to maintain myself. So I chuckled, and he looked at me, and he was like, with this expression, why are you laughing? And he didn't get it. He didn't get it. And what was even worse is that he thought that I was there to see some DEI. So back to the point. One of our greatest orators, I believe, and I'm sure many of you believe, was Dr. Martin Luther King. And one of the things that he did during his life, Dr. King would get a theme, and he would hang with that theme over time. And so between the years of 1959 and 1965, Dr. King would deliver different variations of the same speech. And so the one that I'm going to talk a little bit about was entitled Remaining Awake Through the Great Revolution. The last time he gave that was in March of 1968. And while I'm not going to go through the whole speech, during the speech, he relayed the story of Rip Van Winkle. He starts out talking about Rip Van Winkle, and many of you know that story. Just to check, if you know the story, raise your hand. Okay, some of you don't know the story. I'm not going to retell the story. But Rip allegedly fell asleep, took a nap under a tree, and slept for 20 years. Right? Went to sleep under a tree for 20 years. And what Dr. King says is that, and I quote, one of the great liabilities of life is that all too many people find themselves living amid a period of social change, and yet they fail to develop the new attitudes, the new mental responses that the new situation demands. They end up sleeping through the revolution. And so one of the things I think he was trying to get at the time that he said it in 1968, is essentially he was saying that there were some people who were among us in 1968 who were asleep during that period of revolution, during the moment. They missed their moment. They were asleep. One of the things I worry about as Chancellor is that we not miss our moment. And so the disproportionate and significant impact of COVID, along with the substantial national attention on the current reality of racism and bigotry, has created what some have described as a vision-building opportunity. This is a time to think and act differently and dismantle the many unfounded, deep-seated preconceptions about the potential and value of large segments of our state's population. There exists currently a moral, and if that's not enough, an economic imperative to remove the inequities that stand in the way of the success of whole segments of New York's population. This reality underscores the imperative to rebuild our systems of education with justice and equity, right? So when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, this is really a conversation about justice. These are not just mild words. So I believe this is a moment for bold actions that are designed to recast what is possible for all students. What is possible for all students? Now, when I became Chancellor in January of 2021, in my acceptance speech, I talked about how we needed a new possible. And it's very interesting that, and I don't know if there's any media here, but often I'm asked the question, what do you're constantly talking about this new possible. See, what I actually think about the education environment is that we need to center what we do in education in what I call possibility. I think all too often, something happens when we look at young people. All too often, something happens when we look at young people, things start to happen in our head. Some young people, we see future, we see possibility, we see excellence, and some young people we look at and we don't see anything. Now, I was recently in a parent meeting in New York City, and there were parents, you get to the meeting early and people are drinking coffee and eating whatever they're eating and they're milling around, and there were some parents who were talking and they were saying things, well, my child wants to be a doctor, or my child wants to go to this college, or my child is taking, in fact, one parent in a middle school said, my child is taking fencing, learning how to fence. And then there were another group of parents, but they were in the back of the room, literally in the back of the room. And they were talking about the safety of their children. They were actually wondering not what their children would become, but if their children would survive childhood. So here's what's starting to happen. The question becomes, how do we create a system where we center possibility for all young people, right? And so I would say to you, if you want to know what did I mean by we need a new possible, what I meant very simply is this, that when you look at a young person and you see him with the pants, the young man with the hat turned around, see, here's what you can't see. You don't know what's around the corner for that youngster. You don't know that young man. Someone asked me about my father, and I'll just say it. You know, my father was a musician, and I used to get this all the time. You know, your father's a musician. Are you a musician? And it was always interesting to me because that's what they thought the possibility was. Right? And so what I'm saying is none of us knows what's around the corner for any young person. So it's important that we treat all of our young people as if they could be anything they want to be. So when I talk about possibility, that's what I mean by the new possible. We have to look at every young person. It doesn't matter what they look like or what they have on, but we have to look at them for their potential. And we need to build classrooms and experiences that will promote their possibility. So I'm talking about how do we transform the education system. So when I think as chancellor, you know, and I think about the vision of education for all New York State schools and for all New York State students, see, I'm convinced that we really need to transform this system that we have. And so for me, the question becomes, how do we do that? And I would say, and it's very interesting because lots of people come to me and they'll say, well, you know, Dr. Young, we need this program or we need that program. Or, you know, and they always, and I don't doubt that we need programs, but trust me, we're not going to program our way out of this, right? It's just like over the last 2 years, our young people, the relationships that they had with significant adults in schools has been interrupted. Many people refer to that as learning loss. Some people refer to it more crudely, which I won't use that expression. What I would say very simply is this: how do we provide the kinds of opportunities we need, they need, so that they are not stuck? Because we know, all of the data tells us that the inequities around COVID just exacerbated existing inequities. So young people who are impacted the most by this dreaded disease were the same families, communities, children who had been impacted prior to COVID. And so what that would suggest, quite honestly, is that if we're serious, right, if we're serious, we would think a bit more deeply about what we offer these young people other than just having summer school. Now, that may rub some people wrong here. Some people might be looking forward to working in summer school. But I'm going to be real clear with you. You know, just having a 5-6 week summer program is not transformative, right? So what am I talking about? What is he talking about? See, here's what we can't use the same excuse that we used to use 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we used to say, well, there's not enough money. We can't reform or transform because there's just not enough money. That's not true today. There's more money in public education today than there's ever been. The question right now is, how do we use this in a way that will transform the system? So it's really not about how do we use this to just create a 5-week summer school program. It's really how do we change the school year? Why do we have a school calendar that's built on an agrarian calendar? This is the 21st century. And so part of what we've got to think about is we have to challenge some of these ideas. I mean, everything that we do, those of you, how many of you work in high schools? Anyone work in high school? All right, middle school? Okay, we have one. And we have a couple of high school people here. Well, here's what we know. Most high schools in America and New York State are still operating on 20th century thinking. Seat time, Carnegie units, and credits. Everything we know about education says that stuff just doesn't work. It's not designed to help our young people get to where they need to be. All of the research talks about young people being able to be engaged, right? Engaged in learning over extended period of time. You're right, to go deeper. That's what the research says. The research does not say getting up every 45 minutes and going to another class is going to help you. It doesn't say that. And so we need to think about how we use the resources that we have in a way that will transform the system. And that's just not a K-12 challenge. That's also a challenge for the academy, for higher education institutions. Because this is where the scholarship is. This is where the research is. And so the question, this is where we should be solving some of these issues, right? This is where we should be, I can't believe that in the 21st century, people in public education are debating how do you teach reading? Or better yet, what? It's funny. Someone said we were in I won't say where, but one of the questions. See, I've been an educator longer than I've been a bureaucrat, so I ask the education questions, and I will ask, a principal or a teacher or someone, talk to me about your math curriculum. And you will be surprised the number of people who start pulling out textbooks. Literally, and they'll say, this is the curriculum. Or they start showing me things that are designed in their head they think will get them a score on a test. And so part of what I think has to happen at the academy, at the university level, along with the P-12 community, is we've got to use this as a vehicle to problem solve. See, we ought to be coming to SUNY Old Westbury to really do some deep problem solving based on the research. We ought to be coming to SUNY Old Westbury to talk about, well, what are some of the policies that should be in place in Long Island to ensure that the education workforce begins to look like the student population? So all young people should be prepared, we believe on the board. Once they graduate from high school, they should have the knowledge, skills, plural, and commitments. Sometimes I used to say dispositions. Before I said dispositions, I used to talk about attitude. And a lot of people didn't like when I said attitude, but sometimes I mean attitude. You know what I mean. But all young people have to have the knowledge, skills, and commitments necessary for civic engagement and academic and career options. And we ought to be talking about that in universities with school districts. It's not, this question about, are we debating should everyone be prepared to go to college? And some people say to me, well, Dr. Young, not every child is going to go to college, so we got to make sure what happens to my child if he doesn't go to college. So here's, again, what we all know in the 21st century. The skills that a young person needs to be successful as college freshmen are the same skills they need to be employed in any meaningful career that will pay a family living wage. So we have to stop this foolishness of saying that there's one path for one young person and another path for another young person. We have to prepare, remember, possibility. We have to educate all of our young people so that whatever they choose, whatever path they choose, and whenever they choose it. See, that's the difference with the 21st century, because we never know when the youngster's going to wake up or want to change or be confronted by COVID and have to change. They have to be armed, right? They have to be armed with those attitudes, right, that would allow them to be flexible enough so that they can make the changes that society demands. The other point that I would make, and it's one that Linda Darling-Hammond often talks about, is that she says in order for young people to be prepared for this 21st century, there needs to be a focus on meaningful and deeper learning. And I'm not going to go through all the things she says. I'm just going to talk about that one, meaningful and deeper learning. And so here's what that kind of says to me. In order for us to focus on meaningful and deeper learning, we have to have assessments that are designed to measure meaningful and deeper learning. So just by nature of that one outcome, that would suggest that we have to think differently about the way we assess our young people. So, and what do I mean? I mean it sincerely, that just giving a young person an exit exam called the Regents is not enough, right? It's just not enough. Those of you who teach in this university know that. You have young people in your class that graduate with Regents with distinction and are not prepared for 9th grade English. And you got to ask yourself, then what's wrong? And that would suggest that we need to think about our assessment strategy very, very differently, right? And notice I said assessment strategy. I didn't say test. We need a strategy that's designed to give students better information about their own learning and metacognitive process, how to learn, how they learn. We need to have assessments that give parents better information about what's going on in school. We need assessments that give teachers and school leaders and district leaders better information. And I would dare say that that's not going to be gleaned from an exam. And so, together with our commissioner and my colleagues on the Board of Regents, we passed something called the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Policy. Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Policy. And lots of people have said to me, why did you choose that? And I don't know how many people saw the YouTube video that was done in Smithtown right after we passed the policy. and it's interesting. When my wife saw it, somebody sent the YouTube to me. And so when my wife saw this video, she looked at me and she said, "Are you sure that's what you wanted to do?" and I'll only say to you, I mean, I can chuckle about it now, but it wasn't funny. And because I'll give you the scenario. There was some gentlemen, it was at night, and they were burying some wood. They were around a fire. And they held up a document that allegedly was our diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. And throughout this scenario on the YouTube, they would say things like, who, and the blankety blank, does Lester Young think he is? And they would drop a page in the fire. And they went on and on and on, equating what they thought I meant by diversity, equity, and inclusion, never once quoting me, right? But I understood they had an agenda. And why I bring that up now is to say to you this, that sometimes in life, you have to decide where you stand on things. And so what I realize now that I'm in prime time, that, and I mean this seriously, that sometimes you have to put a stake in the ground and decide where you stand, right? You have to decide. And so I made a decision. And why did I make the decision? And I'm just going to talk about a couple of things that I believe in. And just bear with me, because some of this may resonate with some of you. See, I believe that every member of humanity has a contribution to make to the whole. See, I believe that. I believe that our uniqueness, our cultures, our languages, and our lived experiences are strengths. And I believe further that we are all strengthened when all members of society have voice and are encouraged to contribute. I sincerely believe that. I believe that everyone should have access to the process and opportunities and resources they need to be successful. And I think that all districts and schools must work, not should work, must work to remove the predictability of success or failure based on race, gender, socioeconomic status, language spoken, sexual orientation, social or cultural factors, or zip code. See, we shouldn't be able to predict how a young person is going to perform just based on what they look like or where they live. I think it's unconscionable when the state data comes out and I ask somebody, who do you think's at the bottom? And they can predict with 100% accuracy who's at the bottom. But then they can also predict who's at the top. There's something wrong with that. See, I believe in something called fair treatment. And I think everyone should have access to fair treatment and opportunity. But I also understand that fair is not always equal. And we, again, have the responsibility as adults to figure out how we create fair and equitable systems for all young people. And so, I don't know if it was up, but I know I saw it on the screen. There was the equity fence. You all have seen it, right? And I've seen all different versions of it. You've seen it where the fence is taller and smaller, and sometimes they got a ladder that's taller and shorter. and other time, I mean, there are all different versions of it. But just think for a moment about this possibility. Suppose there was no fence at all. Think about that. Suppose there was no fence at all. See, sometimes I think we worry about the wrong stuff. So maybe what we ought to be doing, rather than thinking about giving children ladders, maybe we should remove the barrier. So we want to do questions, correct, Doctor? Yeah. See, I also believe that schools should foster a culture of open-mindedness, compassion, and inclusiveness among everyone in the school. I believe that. Right? E.B. Du Bois wrote a wonderful speech, and he called it The Right to Learn. And those of you who are students, you need to Google that speech. You can find it. He gave it in 1940, I don't know, maybe 43, 40 something. But in the speech, he talks about, of all the rights that we all have fought and died for, of all the rights, the most fundamental right that we have is the right to learn. Right? And he goes further. He says not just the right to learn what some people think, right? It's the right to learn what other people think, right? It's the right to learn what other people believe, right? He said that's the most fundamental right that our young people have, and that we should struggle to the last ditch to ensure that all young people have the right to learn. So, you know, and every time I hear this business about people saying, well, we're not going to teach this, and we're not going to teach that, you know, we're not going to talk about people who were enslaved. You know, that's almost like when someone said, I was looking at one of the news channels, and they said, we're not allowing anyone to talk about what happened to George Floyd. And I kept saying to myself, well, how do we talk to our children? Are we asking them to unsee what they saw? Right? What they saw with their own eyes? You know, for example, do you think with all the degrees and titles that I hold that I can forget what it was like in 1961 to be told that I couldn't walk on a sidewalk in Richmond, Virginia? Now, I could walk around with a rage, and that's the focus of a different talk. But today, I would say to you this, that's part of who I am. So you can't ask me to deny it. The question at hand is where I started when I began, was that each generation since the founding of this country has had the charge to either fulfill their destiny or betray their destiny. And so what do I mean? I mean that our destiny is what the values and principles that this country was founded on, right? This idea that we're going to build a system for all. But in order for us to build a system for all, we have to understand that all has never meant all. And so it's up to us to figure out how we change that. And so those things that I said that I believe in form what I think are the values and principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so if any of those things resonate with you, and you question, well, can I subscribe to diversity, equity, and inclusion? If the answer to any of those questions was yes, then you believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Because we do need everyone. We all benefit. Yeah, we all benefit when we don't leave anyone behind. You know, having a diverse, educated workforce is not something that's just good for kids of color. That's good for everyone. Everyone needs to see the diversity of the world, right? We need to be able to experience it, and we need to understand that that's just the way the world is. And so we created a policy on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I'm going to go very quickly now because I want to have some time to answer questions that you may have. I guess I have to. Okay. I don't know. What do I do? What? Go right ahead. I'm not shy. Go right ahead. Oh, okay. All right. So, can all children succeed in a safe, nurturing, and engaging learning environment? I believe the answer to that is absolutely yes. And so, the Board of Regents, and it's interesting, we did this in a two-step process. The first thing we did in April of 2021, we had a discussion in a public meeting on what we call the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Framework. And the framework was just that. It was a framework. And really, what I said, it was our way of telegraphing or signaling to the world what's coming next. Right? So we weren't just going to spring this on people. We're saying that this is what we're thinking about. We believe that the interesting thing about diversity, equity, and inclusion is that those three concepts have to be foundational to the entire education enterprise. So when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I should see it in the curriculum materials, in the instructional approaches, in the staffing that goes on, in the kind of leadership development that goes on, right? In the kinds of opportunities that we provide all students. You know, when we have the state has a database now that shows every high school in New York State, and it shows very specifically, down to the student, who has access to advanced placement and who doesn't, and when they have access. And it's a very interesting database. Right. And so when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is, you know, what is the information that drives what we do? So we want to create an environment where all young people can be successful. So what do we mean by diversity? See, that was the first thing that lots of people got hung up on. And my job for the rest of the evening is, I'm not trying to be instructive, I'm just trying to give you some things to think about. So when we talked about diversity, the thing that I'm clear about in education is that this idea of a one-size-fits-all doesn't work. I'm a big believer that there is a context for everything that we do. And so I don't expect, if you live in the South Bronx, that you're going to operate in the same context as if you live in the North Country. So I think there's got to be room for people to figure it out. So, diversity. The next, equity. And I talked a little bit about what I think about when we talk about equity, right? And we talked about fairness. But we also understand fair doesn't mean, right, that we do the same thing for everyone. Because we all know that we're all starting in different places. And we have to do different things. We have to be smart enough and flexible enough to figure that out and admit to it. But the interesting thing about equity is this. You remember what I said earlier? You have to be very intentional that you're actually concerned with each and every young person. Even that young person in your class that tries your soul every day. Right? You know who I'm talking about. I know I had a couple of them when I was a teacher. I mean, some of them put my test of beliefs and values I would just say, if I could just get to the end of the day. But you know what I mean. The other is this notion of inclusion. And so you notice I'm not reading these things to you. I'm just sharing them with you because I would never try to insult you. But it's important that you know that we had something in mind when we talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We weren't talking about DEI. All right. I think that point's been made. That's interesting. So what are the components of our diversity, equity, and inclusion policy? They're very simple ones. There are 6 components: governance, teaching and learning, workforce diversity, and maybe I'll just go back. Governance, see, we understand that governance is really about policy development in school districts, right? New York State is divided up into dependent and independent school districts. We have 733 school districts. The vast majority are run by school boards. School boards make policy decisions about what happens in their district. Those policies drive behavior. So what we're saying, quite honestly, in a district or in a state that's concerned with diversity, equity, and inclusion, that governance becomes very important because the policy, see, you may have policies that are in place that are moving you away from the goals. So what's one policy that exists in every district that could be a challenge? And that's, for example, the suspension policy, right? There's still places, there are lots of places who will say our suspension policy is based on zero tolerance, right? And in this environment that we're in, lots of people will say to me, well, you know, you have to have zero tolerance, Dr. Young. You know, you can't allow this to go on. But we also know that there's an unintended consequence of zero tolerance. So let's move forward. So governance is important. We're asking that school districts look at their governance policies, their structures, and determine the impact. Obviously, for those of you who teach policy development, you may be in the audience, one of the things that you know is that when you develop a policy, you should, before you implement it, you have to think about how is that policy going to impact the very people, right? How is it going to impact people? Is it going to have an equitable impact? So teaching and learning. What we're saying is the whole spectrum of teaching and learning should be considered when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and you know everything that comes under teaching and learning. So I won't go through that except to say that you must include assessment with that. Workforce diversity, and we mean the entire spectrum of workforce diversity. Teachers, teacher assistants, support staff, school leaders, superintendents, on and on and on. Family and community engagement / expectations. What do I mean by / expectations? See, we know in New York State there are lots of places where parents appear to be engaged, but the system is not responding to their expectations. So, in public education, we have a responsibility to make sure that, number one, we understand, well, what are the expectations of the community? You know, what does the community want? I mean, I think that's important. You know, what I was in, I met with someone from a place, Rush Henrietta School District in Monroe County. And just as by the way, they were embarked on their diversity, equity, and inclusion implementation strategy. And they had something called like the equity steps. And they had 10 steps. And what they did, I thought, was very novel. They started out with the first one, and the first step was to build allies. And so what they said, this was the school district, they said that the first thing we needed to do was not to work on people in the schools and not to work with the schools. The first thing we needed to do was build allies in the community, to work with the community so the community would understand what we're doing in the schools. Now, you might say, if we had done that across the state, we'd have less confusion now. So family and community engagement is an important component. Diverse schools and learning opportunities. And so this is an interesting one. The last time I was here in March, there was a gentleman who said to me, I don't know, he may even be here today, he said, why aren't you focused on just making sure all the schools are integrated? And I said to the gentleman, I'm not against integration, but I'm also smart enough to know that not every problem in schools is an education problem, and that you can't apply education solutions to political problems, right? And he kind of looked at me, but I'm going to say it publicly so we're all clear. See, I understand, you know, I think if I could wave the wand and we have diverse schools, I'd love to see it. But while we're marching right toward democracy, while we're trying to get there, we need to figure out how we have diverse learning opportunities for our young people, right? Because here's the other thing that's happening now. All across the nation, but it's happening in New York. There are places in New York where young people, particularly poor young people of color, are going to school with other poor young people of color, and no one is proficient. I mean, just think about that. So we have situations now where kids are going to school with other kids and they're not successful. They never see anyone that looks like them that is successful. So therefore, if I can't see it, how can I be it? Right? We have to reframe this thing. Remember what I said, it's not just about having summer school. We have to transform what we do. And the final one is the area of student support, wellness, and discipline. See, I actually believe that in school, we have to be concerned with the well-being of all young people. I do believe that. I also believe that that's supported by all the research. However, I am concerned that right now the buzzword is if we could just do social emotional, everything would go away. And you all know what I'm talking about. Everywhere I go, people say, if we could just do social emotional, they got acronyms for that. They say they got curriculum and they got this and they got that. In fact, people are now saying if we could just do that, we need to do that before we teach the children. What does that mean? You know, and I will tell you, that goes against everything we know about learning and development. All of the developmental pathways are inextricably linked together. Cognition is related to social development, emotional development, physical development. If you're not feeling well, how are you going to focus cognitively? Right? If you don't feel good about yourself and who you are, or if you're denied instruction that will tell you who you are. Right? If we don't look at a youngster's linguistic development as something that's of value, that is an asset and not a deficit. See, all of these things are connected. You have to be concerned with all of the developmental pathways, not just social emotional. And that's what I mean when I say we have to examine our systems, because some of these systems are by their very nature designed to not advance everyone. So student support services, wellness, and discipline. And I just say one final word about student support. In this moment we're in, because people say, well, look, let's hire more social workers. I love social workers. Right? Let's hire more counselors. Let's do that. But let's make sure, you know, something that Linda Darling Hammond said many years ago. She wrote a book based on Du Bois' speech that I talked about. Her book was called The Right to Learn. And she says that the skills that good teachers need, they have to know their content, you know, they have to know their pedagogy. However, the most important thing that effective teachers have to know is they have to know the students they're teaching and how they learn. Right? It's not enough to just be smart. Right? So it's important that as we think about bringing on these new dimensions into the school, that we just don't do lip service to something called cultural responsiveness, that we actually work, and I think, again, this is an area that the academy has to help us with. How do we help all of our professionals understand the cultural value that each youngster brings to the learning situation? How do we help everyone understand that difference is not deficit, right? That youngsters typically come to school with everything that they need to be successful. Right? And it's up to us. You know, it's almost like, you know, we have a saying in education, and I hear it all the time when I talk to early childhood educators. They say, well, you know, these children are not ready for kindergarten. I hear it all the time. They're not ready. They say they're just not ready. I mean, people want to argue me down. They're not ready, Dr. Young. And you know, it's your fault because you're trying to give them a test in the third grade. They come to us, they're not ready. And I keep saying, if they're not ready, what better place to get ready than in your classroom? And so why aren't we talking about that? Right? If a young person comes to you with all the degrees and certification, you know, let's talk about what we have to do in the walls of this school to make sure that they get ready. So I'm going to end, because I think I may have overextended my time, with a couple of just quotes. I talked about where I alluded to this idea of courage. So we're in a moral moment. I think we're in a moment of leadership. I also think the leadership moment that we're in for educators requires a high modicum of courage, right? And what do I mean by that? R.M. Franklin, he talks about moral leadership. Actually, he's written a book, Moral Leadership, Integrity, Courage, and Imagination. And he says that courage is leadership affirmed. It requires that we step forward, particularly when so many have decided to step back. And then he goes further. He says, I call on those who have accepted the charge of educating our next generation to defy the force of complacency and step forward. So I would close with this. I would implore all of you to step forward. Thank you. Sure. Good.
Thank you all. We'll now open the floor for Q&A. We have a microphone in the middle. Please proceed to the microphone and ask your question. Have a question. Just introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Chancellor Young, thank you so much. I'm associate professor here of history, 19th century historian, really inspired, and just I'm so inspired by what you talk about, cognitive developmental pathways. And I was talking about this in my African American history course yesterday, and I think it's so relevant to mention when thinking about enhanced possibilities and this notion of being courageous. And it's important to note just across the disciplinary spectrum in terms of boldness and fearlessness that African Americans during the Black Convention movement during the 19th century were responsible for framing what became the compulsory education model right after slavery ended, right? That they wanted to see possibilities for all during the 19th century, and then Brown v. Board of Ed sort of later, right? So diversity, inclusion, equity, I'm so inspired, I'm so struck, but it's also important to note that African Americans, before slavery ended, right, and I was just talking about it, that's why I'm so passionate and so struck by it, they created their convention movement and legislated, were interested in policy, mandatory compulsory education for all of us in the 19th century, right? So that model, and it's okay to say that, right? So you were inspirational, instructive, connecting a number of things, and my comment is just as a note of gratitude here, as a member of the community at Old Westbury, very mission-based, and you're right, we need to come together at the table and to advance how to make these changes and about policy, but to have these conversations about things that haven't been had before, right? Thank you.
You know, thank you for that comment, and you're absolutely right. You know, historically, you know, one of the things that we don't often teach in our K-12 system is that the very concept of universal schooling for all is an outgrowth of what Africans in America aspired and developed during the period of enslavement and after. And we don't often talk about that, right? You know, in fact, sometimes it's just glossed over, but when we do talk about people, it's as though education is foreign to their experience, and there could be nothing further from the truth. But you're absolutely right. Thank you for that. Yes, sir. Please use the microphone. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Joseph Leonard. I'm a observer. I'm in, trying to think of what to say exactly. This question is not meant to be an insult, but every teacher I've observed and had has said that the Regents has made it worse to learn because they're forced to students are forced to memorize facts instead of thinking critically. What do you say about that? Because that is what I honestly think that's true. It's not your fault, but they all say this. Instead of being able to teach the students how to think critically about history, they're forced to memorize facts for the Regents, which takes up weeks of time that could be learned to help them.
Yeah.
What do you say
What do I say?
about that? Look, it's not an insult towards you.
No,
It's
no.
what they all say.
Listen, you know what? I didn't start the thing, but I currently have the responsibility of fixing it. So, I'm thick-skinned. But so here's what I say. It was, what you described wasn't always that way. And if we were able to really sit down and talk about it, what you described, this idea of just teaching to a test, is something that happened during what I call that march toward democracy. See, someone talked about compulsory education and on and on and on. And again, that's a whole other discussion, but what I will say to you is that when the compulsory education law, when President Johnson first instituted the idea of compensatory education, look, I'm going to get to your question. What he said was that there was a segment of the population that needed to be compensated for what occurred to them historically in America. And so they passed something called the Compensatory Education Act. And he said if we could just put more money in education, we could right all the wrongs. Now, some of you recognize that as Title I. That's how that started. The idea was if we could just give them extra money, that we'll do what's right and everything will be all right. And then what happened a few presidents later, President Bush came in and said, look, we've been given all this compensatory money, Title I money in these districts, and nothing has changed. And so he came up with his very famous leave no child behind. And they started to institute federal sanctions for low performance on tests. And everyone felt that if we could just find someone and make them guilty, right? We went on a search for the guilty. I went to, I'll pick on Dr. Rux. This is just, I know Dr. Rux, but, Dr. Rux, I don't know why all your children are not proficient, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to beat you up, blame you, I'm going to talk about you in the press, I'm going to make you have meetings with your parents, and you're going to talk about how your school is low performing. Then I'm going to tell you to tell your parents, not me, you go tell your parents that because your school's low performing, you can now take your child out and go someplace else. That's what happened. That was the policy. And so then what schools started to do is they say, well, look, we don't want this to happen. Superintendents didn't want to be put on the spot. Principals didn't want to be put on the spot. And teachers didn't want to be put on the spot. So they said, well, we need to do the next best thing. We need to make sure our kids get the score on the test. We're not concerned with what they know. We're not concerned with, are they going to continue to develop a love for learning? What we're going to do is narrow our focus and narrow our curriculum so that we just focus on young people passing the test, and then we're going to have more and more sanctions. And I will tell you, what I now know and what you know is that strategy has not worked. So when you say that there are teachers who say whatever they got to say about the Regents, I don't doubt that that's true. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I think, for me, I have two options. You know, why I ended with the issue of leadership, I said some people want to step back. Well, there are some people who just want to stay where they are. I refuse to do that. I would say the wrong thing is to do nothing. So I believe we have to step forward. So what I say is that, and you may not know this, but the board, in October of this school year, we announced something called the Performance Assessment Network Pilot. And we are going to be, in fact, the commissioner and I are meeting Monday to talk about how we create a statewide performance assessment pilot designed to change the New York State assessment strategy. So, yes, sir.
I actually wanted to say one more thing, is that
Go right ahead.
what the teachers wanted to say, this was an idea, they all said, much less multiple choice, more critical thinking. Get rid of the multiple choice and make the Regencies about writing essays in the Regents' times. It would actually encourage critical thinking and less memorize blank facts. That's what they want. They don't want to have to memorize all these multiple choice scantrons. That is the problem. They need to learn critical thinking, which is essential. That is what the Regents should focus on, not filling out 50 multiple choice questions, writing paragraphs and essays in the time assigned.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually think you're right. I don't know how else to say it. Dr. Dingle here. I would just say, I hate to do this. Dr. Dingle, could you just raise your hand again? Dr. Dingle, just so you know, is responsible for everything P12 in the state education department. Everything. So when she's here, and I'm sure she's taking note of these things because obviously these are important. Yes, sir.
Chancellor, I'm so delighted that a former student of mine asked those questions. The problem is, and this is how we can help the educational system, the problem is with the assessment. You pointed out to the assessment. The tragedy in education is that we teach collectively, but we assess individually. And until that changes, we will not make any progress. Therefore, as Joe was pointing out, when we help those who are practicing instruction, they need to understand that assessment is not assessment of learning. It's assessment for learning. It must become part of the instruction. That's where we're willing to help them.
Thank you. You know, I appreciate that comment, and you know, there is a historical point to your comment. There's a very, and again, the teacher in me makes me do this. There's an important scholar that everyone should know. His name is Dr. Jarvis Gibbons. He wrote a very important book, Fugitive Pedagogy. He's a young man. He's a professor at Harvard. And he points out he raises the issue that you just raised, that there is a social context for schooling and learning, and it's part of, there's a historical component to it, but also there is something to be said about the collective and collective approaches to teaching, learning, and assessment. And he even goes further in terms of what he calls community reading comprehension. Now, I'm not going to give the book away, give the theme of the book away. I would just suggest that for those of you who are interested in what was just said to me and you want to know more about it, and practical solutions as to how to do it, you would want to read some of Dr. Gibbons' work. Sure.
So I'm asking the question because as a president, you don't have a lot of opportunities to have these kinds of exchanges, believe it or not. My question, I have to craft carefully, because if heard wrong, it could feel wrong. If said wrong, right, it also could feel wrong. So my question is two-part. You said somewhere in your comments or throughout your comments that your challenge with the term DEI is that it doesn't give a, if you will, a full treatise on the issue of justice. Is that fair? And I happen to agree with you. So my first question, and then I have a second one, is if inclusion is about the placement of groups who had historically not been allowed to participate in a venue, and when we talk about education, educationally or intellectually, pardon me, their intellectual contributions of the intellectual contributions of their group have not been a part of the evolution of the ideas being explored, right? So inclusion is about making sure they're there and they set aside one another. Equity is about making sure they get the appropriate treatment, right? So that makes sense to me. I asked this question in a different variation the last time we were together, and it was about critical race theory and how it's complicating the work at that time of superintendents. In this context here around critical race theory, my question for you is, there has been the advancement of ideas, and not under the aegis, if you will, of racism or white supremacy, the idea that some cultures, when set aside one another, are offensive and even reprehensible, even the historical baggage they bring to that moment in space. If that is possibly true, how do you, within the educational framework, the DEI framework that you offered up, deal with, which I find to be part of the core argument within critical race theory, is certainly when you bring people who my ancestors have enslaved, treated improperly, you bring it to a young learner who's a second grade, developmentally, are they able to deal with that message? How do you account for that within an educational framework? And that fundamentally is that when you bring those issues, that baggage and even some of the other elements, right, that are cultural or otherwise, right, into that moment. And the idea is that DEI is to welcome, affirm, right, elevate the humanity of every person in that space. That when you put on a second grader, third grader, something as horrible as the enslavement of another group of people, how do you achieve the idea of recognition, of affirmation for that person who is complicated by that notion? Second question is an easier one. Maybe I'm assuming the first one it was a hard one. Second question is, we often talk about, and I'm an educator, obviously, right? We often talk about education being the key toward making us more democratic as a society, the key toward dealing with social ills, et cetera, but key toward achieving greater levels of justice in this society. Do you ever wonder whether or not education is wrongly, or that expectation is too great a challenge for education singularly to meet? That when we look at the complexities of justice or injustice, it's greater in its manifestation than simple education, right? Do you think education alone, if you had it, done it right, that it could solve all of society's injustices?
So, Dr. Sams, you know, those are, you're right, those are very deep questions you asked. So I'll give an answer. I'll try to give justice to the importance of the question. I mentioned earlier that you have to get the problem right. It's interesting, you know, Malcolm X said many, many years ago that when you live in stress, in order to get yourself out of the stress, you have to understand the nature of the problem. And you're right. Throughout history, people have said, well, if you just get an education, and I'm going to try to answer both questions, but if you just get an education, that will be it. And here's the truth. The truth is, the education is the passport, but it's not the end, right? It is not the only thing that you need. So the question becomes, remember I said it wasn't enough to just be smart. See, we know that smart people do dumb things all the time. And I don't say that to be funny, but you all remember a few years ago when the whole economy was tanked because there were some smart, very smart, well-educated people on Wall Street who were more concerned with their personal greed than they were with the collective. And so they were ready to sacrifice all of us for their own gain. So what young people are like, so when we're talking about educating youngsters, it's not just education to pass a test. It is also, we need to be concerned with what young people are like, right? What you do with what you know, right, is it's determined by what you're like as a person. And so I believe that education is a necessary first step. I actually think it's not just education, it is a successful education. See, that's the other problem that we have, because sometimes we think that just the mere fact that you go to school, that's enough. So I think that we're in a moment where we have to be a bit more explicit about what we mean by this thing called education. I think we need to talk about that. I think historically, what we know throughout the different stages of American development, people talked about that. I mean, there was a time in American history where people in communities, where the entire community was of one accord. The whole community was together around the development of children. You know, Dr. James Comer says, very eloquently, it was as though all of the adults were in a conspiracy against children, right? It didn't matter who the adult was or what station the adult was, they expected you to do right. And if you didn't do right, the adults took responsibility to either correct you or get some message to the parents. See, we were all of one accord. What has happened, unfortunately, we've taken the collective out of education, and we allow things to happen right in our own communities as if the stuff doesn't affect us. And so I actually think we should take some of these concepts that we now have funded like community schools and 21st century and all these things that are supposed to bring communities and schools together, where we ought to be talking about what does it mean to be educated and how do we work together as a community to ensure that we're all moving in the same direction. See, and I actually think we need to do more of that. I think the university can help us figure that out. Let me get back to your other more challenging question. See, I do believe that education is a necessary first step. I don't believe that education will solve all of the challenges. I also believe that without discussing these difficult concepts or discussing the history of America accurately, we won't know that some of the images, some of our beliefs about people, right? You know, I know exactly what you mean. Some people believe that just the very association with someone that looks like me could be a problem. And it's interesting that E.B. Du Bois talked about that also. He talked about, you may remember, how does it feel to be a problem, right? He wrote a very important book where he talks about how does it feel to be a problem? How does it feel to look at yourself through someone else's eyes, right? See, that's what I mean when I talked about possibility. There are young people, the only image of themselves is what somebody is telling them. That's what we have to try to figure out. That's not easy. That's not easy. And when I started out talking about the Roman Colosseum, see, trust me, we'll never be able to get to that discussion on Instagram or Twitter. Right? We can't. But we can if there were community dialogue sessions. You know, there's a wonderful book. I'm sorry, but it's called Defining Us. Wonderful author wrote Defining Us, but the key is that communities all across America are deciding to read this book. And they're deciding to come together to talk about how do we live together as a community. And what people are finding out is that that's having a huge impact on changing behavior. And so what I think actually is that we need to have more opportunities where we can come together and talk about, well, number one, what do we mean by education? It can't just be the school people doing this. It's got to be, what exactly do we mean? You know, what does the business community have to say? What does the faith community have to say? Right? What do those among us who need a second chance have to say? And then how do we put those things in place to make it happen? I personally don't think there's an easy answer or solution. In fact, I'm convinced there is no one solution here. But I do think the path rests with our ability to come together and to begin to say we once and for all want to create the kind of developed community where all of the youngsters in this community can be successful. You gave me one more thing to think about, Dr.
I'm here all day.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Grace. So this is a little bit less about the DEI, and it's more about assessments and being on grade level, like performance-wise. So I know that you mentioned the comment about the kindergarten students that weren't ready and still having them in the classroom to enhance their learning and learn that in that atmosphere. So many teachers in districts, I'm sure you know, are experiencing the conceptual gaps from COVID, and they're seeing a lot of students performing significantly lower than grade level. And so I guess my question would be, with regards to the pressures from state assessments, What do you believe we should do about rectifying those gaps, whether it's accelerating the content acquisition or limiting or transferring the state standards elsewhere? I know that that's kind of a not easy to do thing, but how would you personally suggest rectifying that?
I think that's an excellent question, and the way you framed it makes tremendous sense, but it's also very challenging. The first thing is, unfortunately or fortunately, the U.S. Department of Education, they have this requirement that we have to give a test and we have to hold people accountable. Even when we requested a waiver, they say we still have to figure out how to do that. But so here's what I think. Well, let me start with what I know. The same children that have experienced the greatest loss as a result of COVID were the children who were the furthest behind before COVID. And one of the problems, quite frankly, it wasn't the assessment, it was the instruction. And so all across, and I'm just going to talk about New York State, and it's interesting the way Dr. Sams put it, because the way you hear it will determine what's said about me tomorrow. So I get it. But I'm just going to say it anyway. That all across New York, there are lots of classrooms where young people never receive grade level instruction. Right? So they're not being taught in ways that's designed to get them where they need to be. We have to admit that. And so if the question is, what do I think we should do? I actually think we need to look at the research on how do you accelerate learning. Because I think part of our problem is the way in which we teach children. A lot of the pedagogical practices that I see in classrooms are not designed. In fact, in many cases, these are practices that are actually barriers to their accelerating their learning. You know, here's what we know. Our children are absolutely brilliant. You know, how do I know that? There are children that are walking around with these, they're figuring most of this out on their own. And if they can do that, that suggests, well, here's the other thing that we know. 10 years ago, we didn't use the word neuroscience. So we are now smarter about learning and development. And the question I have to ask you, if you're an early childhood teacher, you probably know this. How much of what we know about how the brain develops are we actually using in the kindergarten classrooms? I mean, let's think, if we're serious about ensuring that all children learn, how are we transferring what we know about 0 to 3? Think about our policies. We have policies in New York State that separate out 0 to 3 from schooling. But what does the research tell us? What does neuroscience tell us about brain development? It tells us that that's wrong. And so, courage. We need leaders who are willing to say to policymakers and elected people that the whole architecture is wrong. We need to be concerned from the moment of conception. I'm serious. And you know, there are programs, this word program, but there are strategies that are designed to do that. But we need to figure that out. So if a school district or a school is serious about early learning and development, then it's important for that school to get out of the four walls of that building and to begin to have those community conversations with parents about what parents are doing with their child 0 to 3. I mean, that's just a fact. The other thing that we have to do, and this is what I'm going to say is evaluative. We've put millions of dollars into universal pre-kindergarten. And all across New York State, we have 4-year-old programs and we have 3-year-old programs. And here's what I've observed. And I'd actually go in and ask the test question. I go and ask principals, teachers. I said, before I go into the classroom, tell me what's the difference between your 3-year-old classroom and the 4-year-old classroom. And the people look at me, they say, well, it's pre-K. But do you understand? Every parent in this room knows there's a big difference between 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. Right? There's a huge difference. And it ought to be reflected in the room arrangement, in the furniture, and the colors, the lighting, all the stimulus and everything. But yet, that for some reason, what we know hasn't gotten into the school. And so part of what I try to think about from a policy perspective is how do we impact that? And one of the things I think we have to do is have more opportunities where we could bring the university together with the public school structures to try to think about how we're really educating young people and what we should do. So hopefully that'll answer part of. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Let's give a round of applause for our Chancellor. Thank you, and thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you in the fall semester for more in-depth discussion. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you at our next talk.